They come with soft eyes and gentle hands, with a voice that never rises and a smile that never falters. They are the ones who always say yes, always accommodate, always bend just enough to keep the peace. On the surface, they are balm and velvet and spring breeze. But deep inside, something else takes root. Something colder, sharper, coiled like a snake behind the curtains of politeness. Maybe we've even been them. That person who never complains, who never confronts, who never says what they really think. Until one day, something snaps. We like to think that niceness is kindness in action, that a gentle manner reveals a gentle soul. But what if that very gentleness becomes the perfect camouflage for cruelty? Not the visible kind, not the slap across the face, but the invisible one, the quiet betrayal, the slow suffocation. Niceness can be a disguise, a shield, a costume worn so tightly that even the wearer forgets it is not their skin. Underneath, something festers, a pressure builds. And when it finally explodes, it does not do so with honesty. It does so with poison. Imagine a rose with petals so soft you could sleep in them, but its roots feed on acid. The nicest ones are sometimes the ones who leave the deepest wounds, not because they shout, but because they don't. Because they smile as they hurt you. Because their silence makes you question your own pain. That is the paradox we'll explore today. The unbearable tension between appearance and truth, between the social virtue of being agreeable and the existential cost of never saying no. And it starts small. Think of that friend who never voices disagreement, who always supports you even when you know deep down you're wrong. It feels flattering at first, then strange, then eerie. You begin to wonder if they have thoughts of their own. And one day you discover they resented you all along. They swallowed every protest, every doubt, every frustration, and digested them into resentment. Their niceness was not a gift, it was a trap. Or take the coworker who never argues in meetings, who always takes the extra work, who never asks for credit. You think they're noble, selfless, perhaps even admirable. But behind the scenes, bitterness brews. They talk behind your back, they feel superior, they nurse injuries no one sees. And when they sabotage your project or undermine your reputation, you are shocked, because you thought they were the nicest one in the room. Niceness, when not anchored in truth, becomes a performance, and every performance comes with an audience, with expectations, with a script. Eventually, the performer tires, and the audience, unaware, claps at the wrong moment. The nicest ones are sometimes trapped in their own character, unable to break out without wrecking the entire scene. They are praised for their composure, but inside, they are screaming, and we all know why it happens. We live in a world where conflict is feared more than dishonesty, where politeness is rewarded more than clarity, where making people comfortable matters more than telling them the truth. So we learn to be nice. We learn to nod when we want to shake our head, to say yes when we want to scream no, to smile when our stomach turns. We decorate our cages with compliments and soft tones, but it's still a cage. We become master painters of harmony, covering the raw canvas of our frustrations with layer upon layer of pastel colors. And the painting becomes so beautiful, so perfect, that we forget where we buried the truth beneath. The spiral begins here. Niceness is not evil. It is not the enemy. But it becomes dangerous when it replaces honesty, when it silences what must be said, when it conceals the darker instincts we refuse to acknowledge. The nicest ones are not always the kindest. Sometimes they are simply the most afraid. Afraid of rejection, of being disliked, of the messy friction of human connection. And so, they trade truth for approval. But the soul keeps the receipts. And over time, the fracture deepens. Niceness that is unrooted from authenticity begins to turn bitter. The person starts to resent their own mask. Every new smile becomes a little heavier. Every act of accommodation becomes a small betrayal. And the bitterness seeks release, not through honest confrontation, but through passive cruelty, through absence, withdrawal, insinuation. The person who once always said yes now begins to sabotage in silence. They become a shadow actor, orchestrating harm while pretending innocence. And when they are finally confronted, they say they did nothing wrong. And they believe it, because they were nice. Here's the subtle hook I promised. Ask yourself this: have you ever been hurt by someone who never raised their voice, who never insulted you, who always seemed so kind? And did you wonder, in the aftermath, how such a nice person could leave you feeling so broken? If so, you're not alone, because what breaks us is not always cruelty in its raw form. Sometimes it's the absence of truth, the softness that conceals the blade, the velvet rope that tightens slowly around the neck. This video is not a condemnation of gentleness, but a call to awareness. A call to examine the masks we wear, the roles we play, and the lies we call virtues. Because when niceness is hollow, it becomes dangerous. And when we mistake it for kindness, we blind ourselves to the warning signs. The nicest ones are the meanest ones, not because they want to be, but because they never learned how to not be. And the deeper question beneath it all: what is the cost of a life lived in silence? What do we lose when we are always agreeable? And how can we reclaim the courage to be true, even if it makes us less pleasant, less likable, but more alive? Kindness, at first glance, feels like a balm. It wraps around us like soft velvet, silky and warm, lulling the mind into quietude, like being slowly swaddled in a cloud of reassurance. But there are fabrics that suffocate as much as they soothe, silks that tighten like snares, knots that bind with smiles rather than rope. Imagine a blade, carefully sheathed in sugar. You touch it, taste it, maybe even trust it. The first sensation is sweetness, disarming and delightful. But beneath that sugary layer lies a serrated truth waiting to be drawn. That is the danger of nice people. Not because they are cruel in the way tyrants are cruel, but because their cruelty comes disguised, infused with a perfume of benevolence, tucked behind gestures that look like affection. There is something deeply human in that mechanism, because we are social creatures, and social creatures learn how to camouflage their instincts to preserve connection. The wolf does not hide its teeth out of shame, but because bearing them would isolate it from the pack. We too have learned to mask the edges of our intentions. What we call niceness is often not a virtue, but a strategy. It is a political maneuver on the scale of everyday relationships, the velvet glove over the iron hand of disapproval, resentment, or desire for control. It is often not a choice to be kind, but a fear of being disliked. That fear forms the invisible skeleton of what we call politeness. Let's pause there. Think of the last time someone smiled at you while disagreeing, or stayed silent when something hurtful was said, only to later speak behind your back. That isn't nothing. That's a performance. A mask stitched together with silk thread and worn in the theater of social life. And the performance works because we want it to. We want people to be kind. We want the surface to remain calm, even if the waters below churn with dark currents. Niceness, in this light, becomes less about the other and more about the self. It's about self-preservation, self-polishing, self-promotion. The nicest ones are often the best at self-curating, editing themselves into likability while hiding entire archives of discomfort, bitterness, or judgment. The most dangerous part is this: they often do it without knowing. The mask eventually fuses with the face. Let's borrow a moment from Immanuel Kant. In his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, he insists that morality must come not from inclination, but from duty. The truly moral act for Kant is the one done not because it feels good or convenient, but because it is willed from rational principle. Now here's the twist: a nice person may help you because it feels nice, not because it is right. And Kant would argue that this makes the action morally worthless. It is precisely this that makes the so-called nice person potentially so dangerous. Their kindness is not anchored in ethics, but in emotional comfort or social calculus. And because they feel good doing it, they may mistake their own pleasure for virtue. The blade gets shinier, the sugar thicker. This is not to say that all gentle people are liars, but niceness and goodness are not twins. Kindness can be cowardly. It can be a disguise for control, or a refusal to confront, or a way to manipulate outcomes. Nice people are sometimes the ones who will never say what they truly think, not because they are tolerant, but because they are terrified of rupture. Now imagine the metaphor as a painting. You look at the canvas and see a field of flowers, pastel and bright. The light is soft, the breeze implied in every brushstroke. But then you step closer and notice that each petal has a little mouth, a little scream, painted almost invisibly. That is niceness, a surface of serenity that under the right light reveals an interior of constraint, suppression, and sometimes quiet rage. This is especially true in the workplace. The colleague who never disagrees in meetings, who laughs at every joke, who nods compulsively in approval. They are the same who may subtly sabotage in private or hoard resentment that festers into passive aggression. They are socially skilled, but ethically ambivalent. Not out of evil, but out of fear. And that is what we must see clearly, that niceness is often a way to avoid risk. Let's bring in Nietzsche. On the Genealogy of Morals, he describes the birth of what he calls the slave morality, a system of values born not from strength, but from weakness. The meek, unable to act out their aggression openly, invent a moral code where restraint, humility, and kindness, they transform their inability into a superiority. They call their powerlessness goodness. Nice people often live in this logic. Their silence becomes politeness, their passivity becomes peace, and their avoidance becomes wisdom. But it is not always so. Sometimes it is just impotence disguised as ethics. You know this, don't you? That friend who never says what they really think, but grows cold for no reason. That partner who never argues, but begins to withdraw silently. That sibling who praises you, but always in a tone that feels slightly off. It's not the presence of cruelty that wounds, but its diffusion. It's like poison diluted in water, hard to notice, easy to drink, and slow to kill. The nicest ones are often the meanest ones, not because they want to be, but because they lack the courage to be anything else. They lack the courage to be clear, the courage to say no, the courage to risk conflict in the name of truth. And so they wrap their thorns in petals, their weapons in lace. And you never see the wound coming because you were too busy admiring the hand that held the knife. Let us not confuse this with gentleness. Gentleness has strength. It is a choice, not a default. It is a conscious way of approaching the world that includes honesty, even when it hurts. Niceness, on the other hand, is a defensive shell. It protects its wearer, not its recipient. We must learn to see through that sugarcoating, not with cynicism, but with clarity. Because behind the smile may not be a friend. Sometimes, behind the smile is a blade. There's a kind of cruelty that doesn't raise its voice, that doesn't slam the door, that doesn't even break eye contact. It wraps itself in politeness, it softens the tone, it walks with small, careful steps so as not to offend. It smiles. It always smiles. And in this smile lies the most exquisite violence because it disarms you while slowly undermining your sense of self. We tend to associate danger with what is loud, disruptive, chaotic. But sometimes the most dangerous force is the one that adapts to your expectations so perfectly that you stop seeing it altogether. It's the sweetness that never says no, the kindness that never confronts, the gentleness that feels like a hug but suffocates just a little. It's not the wolf in sheep's clothing. It's the sheep that teaches you to silence the wolf inside yourself. This form of behavior is not simply passive-aggressive, it's existentially manipulative. It builds its power not by domination, but by withdrawal. By abstaining from anger, from confrontation, from discomfort, it gains moral high ground. And when someone always seems agreeable, always seems flexible, always seems above conflict, you begin to doubt the legitimacy of your own frustration. You feel guilty for even wanting to draw a boundary. And in this way, the kindest people can become tyrants of subtlety. This is what the philosopher Michel Foucault would call a form of soft power or disciplinary control. Foucault didn't just study prisons or mental institutions. He explored the invisible ways society exerts control through norms, expectations, and the silent internalization of rules. He argued that modern power doesn't function by threat or violence, but by normalization, the pressure to conform to unspoken standards of what is acceptable, polite, proper. In this light, extreme niceness becomes a tool of normalization. The overly nice person becomes a subtle enforcer of emotional compliance. You feel the pressure not to be angry, not to disagree, not to disrupt the surface harmony, because doing so would make you the problem. And so, like Foucault's panopticon, a prison where inmates behave because they might be watched, we self-regulate. We smile back. We betray ourselves. The metaphor I offer here is that of a silk rope. It's beautiful, soft, almost comforting to the touch. But pull it tight enough, and it strangles. The violence is not in the material, but in the tension. We think of violence as sharp like a blade, a scream, a blow, but there's also the violence of suffocation, of never allowing truth to erupt, of gently insisting that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. And this suffocating kindness, this charming emotional control, is rarely conscious. That's what makes it so effective, because it often comes from a deep fear, the fear of being disliked, of being rejected, of being unmasked. The overly nice person doesn't want to be hated. They want to be safe. But to be safe, they have to control the environment. They must preempt conflict, remove tension, over-accommodate, and project perfection. And in doing so, they create an atmosphere where no one else is allowed to be real. They rob the space of friction, and with it, of authenticity. Think of how many times you've said yes when you wanted to say no. How many times you've nodded politely while something inside you screamed. That tension is the theater where this problem plays out, and we all perform in it, whether we are the ones being too nice, or the ones slowly numbed by someone else's suffocating pleasantness. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard helps us here. In his text, The Sickness Unto Death, he explores the concept of despair, not as a mood, but as a condition of misalignment with oneself. For Kierkegaard, the greatest despair is not screaming in agony. It's living a life where you never become yourself. The person who is too nice lives in this quiet despair. They are alienated from their real thoughts, their real anger, their real desire. They've replaced those raw inner truths with a smooth, socially acceptable mask, a porcelain shell that cannot afford to crack. And yet, others feel it. They may not know why they feel unsettled or why the relationship feels so cold despite all the warmth. But we sense when we are not in contact with someone's soul, when we're only speaking to their projection, their performance. And eventually, that becomes unbearable. It feels like being in a room with no oxygen. This is why conflict, however uncomfortable, is a sign of life. It means something real is being touched. It means two people are willing to risk discomfort for the sake of truth. And in contrast, the person who avoids all conflict, who never raises their voice, who makes everything feel smooth, that person may seem like a blessing. But sometimes they are just a well-decorated prison. So yes, the nicest ones can be the meanest ones, not because they intend to harm, but because in their refusal to be real, they invalidate everyone who is. Their perfection becomes the knife with which you cut your own voice. Their calmness becomes the silence that eats away at your truth. And their unshakable kindness becomes the storm that no one dares to name. But the good news is, this too can be unlearned. And that's where we're going next. There is a moment, subtle and imperceptible, when being nice stops being a choice and starts becoming a disappearance. A moment when you are still talking, still smiling, still nodding, but something in you has begun to vanish. Not all at once, not dramatically, just softly, quietly, like fog dissolving at dawn. Self-effacement sounds like a virtue, We're taught to be humble, to put others first, to soften our ego, to step aside for the greater good. But when taken too far, self-effacement stops being humility and becomes erasure. You no longer step aside, you are nowhere to be found. You become a ghost that everyone likes but no one really knows, and strangely, they seem to love you more for it. This is where the trap begins. Because the more you disappear, the more validation you receive. You're praised for being agreeable, easygoing, adaptable, for never making things complicated. But deep down, there's a cost. Every time you suppress a need, every time you silence a no, every time you shrink to make room for others, you leave a piece of yourself behind like a breadcrumb in a forest that no one else will ever walk. Let's call this trap the mirror lake. At first glance, it's serene. Flat, reflective, calm, it mirrors everything around it perfectly. But the lake has no shape of its own. It only reflects. It becomes whatever surrounds it. And if you live like that, if you're always mirroring others' needs, desires, emotions, you forget the texture of your own voice. You become the lake, smooth and deep and silent, and yet hollow at the core. Simone de Beauvoir, the great existentialist philosopher, warned against this. In The Second Sex, she wrote about how women in a patriarchal society are often conditioned to exist not as subjects, but as objects defined not by their own essence, but by their usefulness to others. She spoke of how a woman might come to see herself through the eyes of another, measuring her worth by how pleasing or helpful she is. Though her analysis was specific, the mechanism she described applies more broadly, the danger of becoming what others need you to be instead of what you are. This objectification, this willing surrender of agency, is the soul of self-effacement, and it's seductive. Because when you dissolve your boundaries, when you agree too easily, when you erase your own discomfort for the sake of harmony, people often reward you. They call you kind, they call you wise. They trust you with their mess and never notice yours. You become indispensable, not because they see you clearly, but because you become their emotional infrastructure. But the human soul cannot thrive in a permanent state of reaction. We are not meant to be mirrors. We are meant to be flames. Flames dance, flicker, burn, illuminate, and yes, sometimes they scorch. But without that fire, you are left cold and reflective, waiting for someone else's light to give you shape. Think of how often you've hesitated to speak honestly because it might make someone uncomfortable. How often you've played the peacekeeper, even when your own inner world was in chaos. How many times you've said, "I'm fine," and smiled when the truth was raw and trembling inside you. These are not small moments, they are sacrifices. And over time, they accumulate like dust in the lungs of your being. The philosopher Martin Heidegger can guide us deeper. In Being and Time, he warned of the danger of what he called the they self, a mode of existence where we lose ourselves in the anonymous crowd, in social roles, in what is expected. Instead of being authentic, we become a series of habits and polite responses. We answer the phone the way we are supposed to. We show up to work with the right face. We nod at dinner even when we're numb inside. This, for Heidegger, was not real living. It was inauthenticity. It was forgetting that existence is not just about being. It is about owning one's being, choosing it, engaging with it, and refusing to let it be dictated entirely by others. And so, the trap of self-effacement is not just psychological. It's ontological. It is a betrayal of your very mode of being. It says, in effect, I will cease to be myself so that others may remain comfortable. But at what cost? Eventually, something begins to ache. Not loudly, it's not a scream. More like a slow pressure, like a chest being compressed. You find yourself tired, but not from work. Disconnected but surrounded by people. Resentful but unsure why, because you were the one who said yes. And that is the cruelty of the mirror lake. It reflects everything, and in doing so, it forgets itself. There is an antidote. And it's not aggression, it's not rebellion, it's reclamation. Reclaiming the edges of your soul, reclaiming your no, reclaiming your voice even when it shakes. It is a return to being a flame. And the flame, as Heraclitus would say, is ever living, consuming, transforming, and never static. This is the nobility of the inner quest. To learn to live, not for applause, not for approval, but for alignment. To say what you mean, not because it's convenient, but because it's true. To be a presence, not a function. A self, not a mask. So next time you feel the urge to disappear behind a polite nod or a gentle smile, pause. Feel the shape of that moment. Ask yourself, am I being kind or am I being erased? Because there's a difference, and your soul knows it. The world does not need more mirrors. It needs more people willing to be seen, even when the light is harsh, especially then. There is a form of courage that doesn't roar, doesn't flex, doesn't stand tall in the storm. It is the quiet courage of someone who chooses to remain soft in a world that's trained them to be sharp, to heal from the twisted paradox of fake niceness and buried cruelty. One must first relearn the language of authenticity. Not the dramatic kind that wears its heart on its sleeve, but the quiet kind that aligns inner feeling with outer action like two panes of glass finely aligned under sunlight. Because in the crowd, we borrow our tone, our smile, our mask from others like one might borrow a coat at a funeral just to look like you belong, just to stay warm. But alone, the silence becomes a mirror. And for the first time, if you dare to look long enough, the shape of your true face begins to emerge beneath the makeup of habits. This is the practice of what the Stoics called prohairesis, the space between impulse and action, where freedom hides. Epictetus believed that no matter what is taken from us, the one thing that cannot be stolen is our capacity to choose our response. And that response, that intention, that gesture, it is what separates the cruel from the kind, the reactive from the free, the mask from the person. When you choose not to disguise your anger with a sweet voice, when you admit to yourself your real envy, when you let yourself feel the burn instead of icing it over, something incredible happens. You begin to integrate. You become whole again, like a cracked bowl sealed with gold. The Japanese call it kintsugi. The art of healing cracks with beauty instead of shame. The break becomes the story, not the wound. And so the path forward is not to become less nice, it's to become more real. Nice is a costume stitched with fear. Kindness is a voice that has nothing left to hide. But how do we become kind again in a world that punished our honesty? By beginning with tiny, almost invisible acts of truthfulness. Saying no when your body screams it. Not smiling when your heart is closing. Looking someone in the eye and letting your sadness be seen. This is not weakness. This is the warrior's path. It's what Hannah Arendt called thoughtfulness, not just thinking, but living with the full weight of one's inner life. And that weight, that quiet pressure of truth pressing up from within, is what cracks the shell of the fake smile. But be careful, kindness is not niceness upgraded. Kindness is something older, rawer, slower. It is the scent of wet soil after a storm, not the perfume sprayed before a party. To be kind is to let the world feel your presence, without polishing it first. To say, here I am, unfinished but real. Philosopher Simone Weil once wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Not the attention we throw like coins for performance, but the kind that says, I am here and I see you. When we cultivate that kind of presence, we change the texture of the room. Suddenly others breathe deeper, speak slower, dare to drop the mask too. And perhaps that's the final gift of escaping the trap of fake niceness. Not just that we become whole again, but that our wholeness gives others permission to begin. Epilogue. So, maybe the question isn't whether you're nice or mean. Maybe the real question is, how close are you to your truth, and do you dare to live from it? Because the closer you get, the less performance remains. And in its place, a silence appears. A silence that feels like home. Let's think together. Not forever, but just long enough to build something real.